Good morning, everybody. We are back. It is day 2 at ERE here at the beautiful Westin Resort in Anaheim. And they want to give me a lifetime pass for promoting them. I'm more than happy. It's a nice hotel, Mark.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I am happy to be here.
Not nearly as many Disney children as I was fearing. So it's good.
So you don't have kids in the room next to you just waking up in the morning?
My eldest is in college.
I'm talking about here. I'm sorry.
My
in this
youngest
hotel.
is a senior in high school. So I say that because even if they were here, which they are not, they would not be up before noon.
No.
So
no way.
Yeah. No.
I actually did hear that for a moment when I checked in. I'm like, oh my God, it's a Disney hotel. I'm going to have kids next to me. I have a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old. I'm like, trying to have a nice little break without them. But Mark Murphy, welcome to the podcast. For everyone out there that does not know Mark, tell us who you are and what you do best.
For the talent space, I'm probably best known for writing the book Hiring for Attitude. So I run a company called Leadership IQ, and we go out and we study what makes great leaders in organizations better, and then we teach it. And so a lot of my stuff isn't HR or talent specific. Hiring for Attitude, obviously, is some of my other courses and books. Like one of my books is Managing Narcissists, Blamers, Dramatics, and More. Or
that's a catchy hook.
Yeah, stuff like that. But when it comes to hiring, it's the attitudinal side.
So let's get into it. If you look for more than 2 minutes on LinkedIn, you will hear hire for attitude, train for skill. And I cringe at that as a recruiter. And I cringe at that because it's certainly clickbaity, but it's also not completely accurate, right? You have to put a big caveat on that because for most roles, aside from most entry-level roles, you need to have certain skills. Yep. So yes, put an asterisk on it, skills first, and then attitude. How should hiring managers really focus on, what are best practices on interviewing for attitude and really being able to decipher what is someone being a really good interviewer versus having the skill, and also removing your biases from the conversation?
Yeah.
So like a 10-part question to start the day.
So a couple of things. One, you're absolutely right. It is clickbaity. And on some level, annoyed by that. On many levels, I'm annoyed by that because that's not, when I wrote Hiring for Attitude, if you go back and you look at Google search trends, Hiring for Attitude doesn't really emerge in Google searches until the book came out. But people then took it and said, oh, skills don't matter. That's not what the book said. The research we did, we tracked 20,000 new hires. 46% of them would fail within 18 months. Okay, that's a problem. But the more interesting finding was why they failed.
Of course.
And 89% of the time they failed, it was the result of attitudinal reasons, not a lack of technical skills. But here's the caveat.
Wait for it.
The companies were assessing technical skills. Because technical skills, if you want to hire a Java coder, for example, here's 50 lines of code, find the errors in the code. You want to hire a financial analyst.
It's binary assessment.
Exactly. Can you calculate a weighted average cost of capital? Here's an Excel spreadsheet, do it in front of me. It's not hard. And so the reason the new hires were failing for attitude was because the skills part of it, the far easier part, was covered. And that was the thing. It's not that you hire for attitude and train for skills. You can do that, for example, if you take a high school kid and you say, I'm going to find the kid with the greatest attitude, then I'm going to pay for their undergrad, then I'm going to pay for med school, then I'm going to mandate 3-4 years of service, residency, fellowship at my hospital. Yeah, you know what? You want to invest a dozen years, knock yourself out. You can absolutely forget the skills for the moment, as long as they have a high enough IQ.
You see the aptitude.
Exactly. But that's the thing. It's hiring for attitude is assuming they have the skill, which is super easy to test. Every hospital on earth does a competency fair for their nurses, for example. Coding tests are incredibly easy to administer. I'm not a Java coder. I can hire a Java coder because the internet is on computers now and I can buy a test that tells me whether or not they can do it. That's the major misuse of this, is that, once you have the skills, now their success is going to be, once you've got the table stakes, now it's necessary but not sufficient. The sufficient part becomes the attitude.
Of course, and we're also assuming that companies, a big X factor on any of this is that a new employee is set up for success when it comes to onboarding. So we're gonna set that one up there. You talk about recruiters and hiring managers needing to break out of the button seats mentality, and I've heard this my entire career. You're recruiters out there, you're just out there to put butts in seats. That's not really it. There's a lot more to what we do here, and then you have to factor in, which you talk about here. You talk about the F word. And I'm going to talk about the F word in my keynote here, fit. I'm sorry if I'm ruffling some feathers here. I despise the word fit. Fit means homogenous. Fit means everyone's going to look like each other. And that's not really what we're going for here. And the wrong hire costs the company money. It's always a tough one. And I like to use vibes. But vibes is also built in with bias too, because then you're assuming your vibe has to match my vibe versus a team or a hiring team really valuing diversity. Diversity of thought, diversity of mindset, not just what someone looks like. You don't want a company full of yes men and yes women. So how do we break out of this like bias and move into more, hey, we need more diversity?
So one big thing, which tends to be the opposite of how most people hire, is if you take everybody in your organization and you say, okay, who are the absolute best performers in the organization? Who are the people in the middle? Who are the worst performers in the organization? If we just took the best and the worst and we said, all right, what do the best people have in common? What are the characteristics, the attitudes, the mindsets they have in common? What do the worst people have in common? Maybe they're inflexible. They resist change. Maybe they're incredibly negative. Maybe they only think inside the box, or maybe they're always outside the box, can't think, whatever it is. If you started there and then you basically said, listen, I need to not hire any person with those low performer characteristics. If all of a sudden you wiped out all of the low performers, which are...
What makes it happen?
If we look at the data, for example, like in our study, it was 46% of new hires failed, 19% became high performers, everybody else was in the middle. If you could greatly diminish the 46% of hiring failures, what you're left with is a worst case scenario of hiring a middle performer, which is fine.
Yes, you can accelerate your company's growth performance.
And it's the low performance, the bad attitude low performers. The worst case scenario is actually what I call the talented terror. They pass the skills test, but their attitude, so they pass the skills test, so you know they've got skills, but their attitude is awful. And so what ends up happening is you have a skilled person who's a colossal pain in the posterior, and now they are a time suck times 10.
Yes.
And so if you just forget the diversity issue for a second, forget the fit issue for a second, and simply looked at who are the worst attitudes in our company, what are those attitudes that they have in common? Let us make a concerted effort to never again hire one of those. Right. All of a sudden, the whole pool
Mark,
changes.
it's a very simple rule that I hear that most companies have. It's a no asshole policy, right? But how do you determine that on an interview? Some people, and listen, raise my hand, before I said, screw it, I'm done working for other people because I don't want to get fired again, I am a really good interviewer. This is why I have a podcast. But I was really good at interviewing. Yeah. And then some roles, I'll be honest, I wasn't that great when I started. And sometimes it was a factor of not being onboarded properly. Sometimes maybe it was a factor of my attitude 15 years ago before I changed who I am and actually grew up. It took me a few years to do that. But the problem is you don't know who those people are until they are actually working in an organization. It's really hard to tell without doing some kind of assessments, which candidates hate. No one wants to sit through some crazy psychological test, whatever. People try to game the system on that. So unfortunately, the way the system works is you don't know who's an asshole until they actually start in the company. The real key to leadership is recognizing that could be your best salesperson. That could be the top performer in your company. But if they're breaking down everybody else, the ROI in that is tremendously negative. And having the ability as a leader to say, that was the wrong choice and you have to go. Versus saying, you know what, that person's bringing in a ton of revenue. How can we fire them?
So that's the talented terror. The interesting thing
talented terror.
You actually can figure out a lot of the attitudes. You can find a lot of the talented terror type personalities in an interview. The problem is that most people are horrific interviewers. And I'll point out a couple of things. Number one, on the assessments, A talented terrorist, smart person can game any hiring assessment they have to be simple, because if you used a real psychological assessment, so I'm married to a clinical psychologist.
God bless you.
If you used one of the ones that only she can administer, it's a clinical diagnosis. That's illegal. You can't do that. So what you have in the assessment world is these watered down nonsense that anybody with half a brain can make come out any way they want.
You reverse engineer it. It's usually a hypothetical question situation.
Yeah, it's nonsense.
How would you handle something? And you're going to say, okay, in my head, how would the right person handle this? Not me.
So what we're left with then is an interview. But here's the thing. Imagine you ask a question. Could you tell me about a time you had to balance competing priorities, and how did you do that successfully? Okay, let's start with the interview question. That question, there's hiring for attitude. There's an entire chapter in the book on this. So this is a giant pet peeve of mine. That question, could you tell me about a time you balanced competing priorities, and how did you do that successfully? What we've just told the candidate is, I don't want to hear about your failures. I only want to hear about a time you did it successfully, and I only want to hear about a time you balanced competing priorities.
Okay.
If we fix the interview question, could you tell me about a time you faced competing priorities? Cover your mouth, shut up, and don't ruin your own question. That's step one. Step two then is that we analyzed over 15,000 candidate responses, good and bad, and found a couple of things. Really good candidates tended to use a lot more past tense verbs, first person pronouns. So they would say something like, I had a time last week when I faced these three competing priorities. Low performer answers used a lot more second person pronoun, present and future tense verbs. So it'd be a lot of, when you have competing priorities, what you should do is.
So accountability right there.
So accountability right there.
You're taking accountability in the answer.
Exactly. So you can see it in their pronoun use and their verb tenses. Low performer answers use a lot more negation and words like no, not, never. They use a lot more adverbs. And without getting too far into the weeds here, the simple reality is that if you start to really listen to the candidate's responses, which again, one of the problems we have when a hiring manager or a recruiter, for example, lines up back-to-back interviews 8 hours a day, people like my wife, the psychologist, they put little pauses in there.
You need the mental refresh.
To get their brain reset to then go into the next client. They're not going back-to-back. And these are PhDs who have done this for decades. They know they need a break. But we put the hiring managers through their back-to-back.
That's recruiter burnout. That's a whole other separate podcast right there. But you do need to have that mental break. And that question is fascinating. And there's another question. I interviewed Rebecca Carr, CEO of Smart Recruiters, a few weeks back. And she asks this question. Tell me the last time you received negative feedback. What was it, and how did you handle it? And that question alone really made me think. Now I don't want you to be like, the worst question is, tell me one of your weaknesses. Mark, let me tell you, one of my weaknesses, sometimes people tell me I try too hard. Come on, give me something there. I want to move forward to a very topical piece here, and I'm very curious to have not talked about this at all, how the election will change the characteristics companies will hire. Do you really think that's going to be an issue?
Yes. I think for a certain segment of companies, ones who were already on the fence for things like DEI, for example, increasing diversity in hiring, I think there are organizations, I'm not saying all, I'm not even saying most, but there's a segment of them that they're going to look at this as a green light to say, we can do what we want to do.
Just dismantle all the initiatives.
Because, listen, prior to this, how many companies publicly said we are ratcheting down our DEI initiatives because a blogger on the right wing, a Twitter influencer, went after them, launched a social media campaign that brought the company to heel. Now, they targeted exclusively customers like Tractor Supply that were serving largely audiences, customer bases that were skewing more right way. Yes. But if you look at Silicon Valley, for example, increased its Republican vote share in this past election. Now, if you look at tech, how many VC people and VC-backed companies have CEOs with pseudo-libertarian kinds of leanings
Right.
who head in that direction. J.D. Vance was in VC. There are ties there. And so you're looking now at Elon Musk, for example.
He's going to be the first buddy.
And so you're looking at a shift where there is a segment that is going to say, I don't believe you've demonstrated the ROI sufficiently. And even if you have, it's still, I'm going to do what I want to do. And there's nobody, the social pressure is, I'm somewhat immune
I
to it.
hate to say this, but this is a real concern. And it is scary. We made a lot of progress, and I fear that we're going to move backwards as well, too. So, Mark, you and I could talk for hours here, but we're not. Tell us a little bit about the book. Tell us a little bit about what your keynote's going to be today.
Yeah, so my keynote today is on how recruiters can beat AI when it comes to evaluating candidates. And we still have a little bit of leg up on humans having pretty good BS detectors if it's applied. And
that is the X factor.
If they pay attention. But we're going to be digging into how do you analyze a candidate's response and a lot of those word choices that picking up on the subtle clues.
It's an energy in the pauses. I have multiple conversations with candidates daily, and it's just that it's that BS detector.
Yep.
You feel it, you can tell it, but also being able to give people a little bit of leeway and empathy. Some people may not be a great interviewer.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really judge. Yes, I judge energy to an extent, but also you have to be mindful of introvert, extrovert. But I'm more interested in what the words they are saying and how they say them.
And if they're giving
confidence,
specific answers with detail, they're not giving when you have competing priorities, what one ought to do is, they're giving good answers, whether they're articulate or not. If their content of their answer is good, then you've got a lot to work with.
Well, Mark, this has been great. I want everyone to check out Mark's courses in consulting, hiring for attitude at leadershipiq.com. We're going to link it up in the show notes. Mark, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Likewise. Thank you.